marks Africa Day, and it commemorates the formation of the Organization of African Unity back in 1963. However, that body was later seen as a toothless tiger. And while peace has returned to many parts of the continent, ongoing conflict in other areas cannot be ignored. So we therefore have to ask, how has the African Union, as well as regional bodies, fared in dealing with violence and conflict? And is the AU a loud enough player on the global stage? Well, let's discuss this with Gustavo de Carvalho, of course, from the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you so much for your time, Gustavo. I suppose let's start here, where, in the continent, obviously there has been conflict over the years, but which areas and regions within Africa still are conflict-ridden?
Thank you very much for having me here. And certainly while we celebrate today, Africa Day, I think it's a moment of reflection, and particularly in the types of advancements that we have done in the last couple of years. We still have a number of conflicts happening in the Sahel region, in Central Africa, in East Africa, in the Horn, but also increasingly also conflicts here in our own region near South Africa, when we have in difficult situation happening in Mozambique and other parts of the continent.
Yeah, and with that being said, obviously there's a hindrance to development. What are the consequences of not having, peace building or, peace talks in these parts of the continent? Especially, we're already dealing with a pandemic, people are losing their lives, and over and above that, we still are dealing with matters of conflict.
Absolutely. I think there is certainly an element of strengthening our own institutions and capacity within the continent, not only to deal with the conflicts themselves, but particularly by creating plans that enable peace to be sustained. There is enough research that shows that most countries most conflicts that reach some kind of agreement, they end up in the first 5 years returning to conflicts. So we need to provide stronger efforts within Africa to ensure that peace is not only created, but peace that is sustained in the long term.
And Gustavo, let's talk about those institutions then. For one, the African Union has been criticized widely for being spineless, indecisive, in other instances, being called, a toothless tiger. How do you think, in your opinion, they have fared, just in terms of dealing with violence and conflict within the continent?
I think it's important to say that the African Union has been a very important institution in the last 20 years to respond to certain crises where the rest of the international community was not able or willing to respond. And whether we start from Burundi to Mali to Central African Republic, the African Union played a very important role. But also in the last 5 years, this very fine tension between the idea of non-indifference in responding to conflicts that are happening in the continent, but also the idea of the sovereignty of the states. It's something that the continent certainly needs to reflect, needs to identify better ways of dealing with its own conflicts to ensure that the African Union is enabled and empowered to respond to the crises that are happening in the continent.
Yeah.
And that can only happen when African states and societies are able to empower that institution.
And does the African Union have, influence, particularly on a global stage here? We know that, they've formed, quite a UN-AU, some sort of a partnership here in terms of peace building in Africa. But is it effective from the stance of AU? Do we see influence there?
There is an acknowledgement, and I think when Secretary General Guterres says that the most important partnership the United Nations has is with the African Union, it's not simply to elevate one of the many regional organizations that are out there. There is an element of the need and a division of labor where the African Union often deploys where no one else is willing to do so. But in order to be more effective, African states need to be able to speak with one voice. They need to increase their leverage, and they need to increase their ability of influencing decisions. And we've seen some progress in the last couple of years. We've seen some progress in the UN Security Council when increasingly African member states are speaking to one voice. And the idea of common positions in such a diverse continent is not just an idea of solidarity as an ideal, but particularly as a pragmatic way in which the African continent can increase its leverage and voice in global discussions.
All right, interesting perspective, and thank you for joining us, Gustavo de Carvalho, of course, from the Institute for Security Studies. A pleasure talking to you.